Good morning, dear folks. And it is that time again on a Friday morning where we have an interesting talk by different people who I may say that it still amazes me the skill of Miss Patsy Sandon at getting all these people to come along and inform us of different subjects. Today we have a interesting one. The title is Pulls Apart Some Incredible Journeys in World War II. And as I don't wish to embarrass myself by getting his surname wrong, I will say it is for you to start, Andrew.
Right. Thank you very much, Ray. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to talk about mostly my parents' wartime experiences. So thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it very much. Now, in a way, I'm going to start at the end rather than the beginning, because I just want to introduce myself briefly to you. So I was born in Palestine in November 1943. My parents were part of the Polish Second Army Corps as part of the British Eighth Army, still in the Middle East. At the end of the war, or soon after, they decided not to go back to Poland, which by then had a communist regime established, but instead they chose to try and settle in England. And they arrived in England, and we settled eventually, after some moving around, we settled in Wembley. In fact, just half a mile from the stadium. I remember when the wind was in the right place on cup final days, we could hear from our house "Abide with Me" being sung in the stadium. I was educated at Gunnersbury Grammar School, West London Grammar School. The building is still very much there. You might have passed it because it's the first big building on the North Circular. As you get onto the North Circular from the M4 and start traveling north up North Circular, the first big building on the left, that was my school, Gunnersbury Grammar School. I eventually read law at King's College, London, and managed to achieve a first-class degree, as a result of which I was invited to apply for a lectureship at the law department of Bristol University. That's what I did, and I was appointed in the summer of 1965. I was only just over 21, well, nearly 22, when that appointment was made. So you can imagine that in my earliest tutorials at university, I was not necessarily the oldest person in the class. There would have been some students actually older than me. In the end, I spent 42 years teaching at the law department, about 9 subjects, or I've counted here, 8 or 9 subjects. But the main ones I focused on were family law, succession, that's about wills and intestacy, and Roman law. And I wrote 2 textbooks for the University of Oxford, the OUP, one on succession and one on Roman law. Now, some of you are thinking, what a complete waste of time to be studying ancient Roman law, writing books about it. Well, not a bit of it, because ancient Roman law still forms the basis of many of the world's legal systems, particularly those legal systems which are based on the French and German civil codes, because those codes themselves were partly based on ancient Roman law. So Roman law is absolutely crucial in the historical development of law in Europe, and actually still plays a part in English law. For example, if your neighbour's tree is overhanging and branches into your garden, can you cut those branches off? You find the answer in Roman law, because there was a Roman law principle that you owned everything above your land and below your land. So that's the principle which English law has actually borrowed in that sort of situation. Now, during my 42 years at the Bristol Law Department, I taught some students who later became quite famous, particularly Paul Boateng, who became Home Secretary for a while in the Blair government, and also a couple of celebrated rugby players. Chris Patterson won 22 caps, I think, for Ireland and played for the British Lions before he got badly injured. And another student I taught became the English scrum half. That was Kieran Bracken, who I think played in the 1990s, something like that. I also qualified as a barrister at Gray's Inn, but I never practiced because I was enjoying teaching so much. I thought that's what I want to do really for the rest of my life. So I never practiced. I met my wife, Margaret, in the law department. She was a secretary there and later a research assistant. We got married in 1973 and moved to Portishead in 1976. And we've lived in our house here in Portishead now for nearly 50 years. A great passion of mine has always been, well, not always, but since about the age of 20, opera. And it's also my wife's great passion. And between us, we've helped to run the Bristol Friends of Welsh National Opera since the late 1970s. And I've been chairman for at least half of the time since the 1970s. Also, I helped to run the Thornbury U3A Opera Group. Why Thornbury? Because we have a very close friend who encouraged me to try and help the Thornbury group survive. And indeed, I've now become the chairman of that group. Another great passion is chess. I play and study chess a lot. I've played a lot of tournaments in my life. And I suppose my best ever result was to win the Somerset County Chess Championship in 1981. Now, I was in my late 30s then, and chess players peak round about the late 30s, and then it's downhill all the way. But I'm pleased to say that I've kept my standard up fairly well, and I'm still playing pretty well in the local Bristol Chess League. I'm now part of the Portishead Chess Club, which started in spring of last year. It's a thriving club. I've become the club captain, and the club has become well known in the Bristol area for the way we encourage juniors to play. We have a thriving, large junior section. So it's a bit noisy at times. A chess club should be quiet places, but occasionally it's rather noisy. But we're proud of what we've done for junior chess in the area. And in fact, tomorrow in the Somerset Hall, our chess club has organised a major tournament for juniors all over this area. So the Somerset Hall will be full of noisy children tomorrow, if you care to call in. Right, okay, well, that's enough about myself. So I'm now going to be talking about my parents' wartime experiences. I'm very happy to take questions at the end of my presentation rather than in the middle. So my father was born in 1896. His name was Franciszek Borkowski, and he was born near Lwów, or Lviv, as we now call it. We know that Lwów is the most western major city in Ukraine, but then it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He regarded himself as Polish, but when he was a young man, 18, he joined the Polish legions, which were part of the Austrian army fighting the Russians, and was twice wounded in the 1914-1918 war. those Polish legions, although they were part of the Austrian army, the idea was, so from the Poles, to try and form an independent army, which would be the Polish army should Poland gain its independence, which it did in 1918. He then joined the University of Lwów Law Department and studied law for 2 years, but his studies were interrupted by the Russian invasion of Poland in 1920. Now, not that many people know about that particular war, but it was the first time that the new communist Soviet state tried to invade a country, and it was Poland. The Russians made quick progress. They almost surrounded Warsaw, but were eventually defeated by a brilliant cavalry charge by the Poles, who had a wonderful reputation down the centuries for cavalry. And this particular cavalry maneuver completely split these encircling Russian armies and made them retreat at a rather fast rate out of Poland. So that was a great Polish victory over the Russians. Had the Russians succeeded in capturing Warsaw, they would have probably gone on westwards into Germany, which at that time was hardly recovered from the First World War, and God knows what would have happened thereafter. So that Polish victory in 1920, and through that cavalry charge, was absolutely crucial in historical terms. After that war ended, my father decided not to return to the Lwów Law Department, but to stay in the army, and in fact, he became a professional soldier. In 1922, he married and had 2 sons a little later. So he remains in the Polish army as a professional soldier. He's promoted to major in 1931. In 1938, his first wife sadly died of TB. So we reach 1939, and my father is in the Polish army, and he's stationed near the German border. Now, the Poles knew that the Germans were coming, but the Polish army was under-equipped and always knew that they would have to fight a kind of organized retreat, waiting for the British and French to actually come in and help. Now, let me pause on that point, because Britain and France had signed a treaty with Poland, I think about 1938, in which Britain and France promised to lend immediate military assistance to Poland if it was attacked by Germany. I'm afraid that did not happen. But the Polish planning of this organized retreat was based on the assumption that the French and British would fulfill their treaty obligations and immediately help Poland. How immediately help? Well, France by invading Germany from the west, and the RAF, Britain, by starting to bomb German cities. That did not happen. And so the Poles were left very much on their own, fighting this blitzkrieg German army and gradually retreating. So my father is part of this retreat. I should say that Poland never surrendered. The Polish army never surrendered in World War II, unlike Belgium and the Netherlands and Norway and Denmark and France, who all eventually sought an armistice, sometimes after one day, as in the case of the Netherlands. Poland never surrendered. The Polish army gradually retreated and a lot of it managed to escape through Romania and Hungary to carry on the fight. Now, let me pause at this point to sort of talk about military things during this Polish retreat that my father is part of. There is this image that the Poles were so useless militarily that all they could do was send Polish cavalry to attack German tanks. That was part of German propaganda that, look at the Poles, they're so hopeless. All they could do is attack our tanks with cavalry. There was never any Polish cavalry attack on German tanks. What they did was to wait for a German tank to become disabled in some way, or to be held up or stuck in a ditch, and then it would be immediately surrounded by 6 Polish cavalrymen lobbing grenades or some kind of magnetic bomb onto the tank and destroying it. And indeed, the Polish cavalry was responsible for quite a lot of destroyed German tanks in that invasion of Poland. What about the Polish Air Force? Well, the Air Force in Poland was quite large, full of brilliant pilots, but they were flying rather under-equipped, inferior planes compared to the latest German machines. And quickly, the Poles ran out of fuel, aircraft fuel. And so the Polish Air Force became, after 2 or 3 days, not really a force in that war. But for those 2 or 3 days, the Polish pilots learnt how to maneuver close to German planes. Because they were slower, the Polish planes, they were able to turn in a circle more easily than the rather faster German planes. And that enabled Polish pilots often to get close to German planes and therefore be in a position better to shoot them down. Now, a lot of Polish airmen escaped through Romania and Hungary, then went through France and ended up in England and played a crucial part in the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940. In fact, one Polish squadron, 303 Squadron, based at RAF Northolt, became the celebrated squadron in the Battle of Britain because it registered the highest number of destroyed German planes and the lowest number of casualties. It's amazing that was the statistic, but that's what it was. The highest number of German destroyed planes, the lowest casualty rate by 303 Squadron. Now, all the pilots in that squadron had survived fighting the Germans in 1939 and were used to these close maneuver tactics that the British pilots hadn't yet mastered. The result was that Polish pilots were able to get much closer in the Battle of Britain to the German planes than British pilots. And so British pilots tended to fire from further away. Polish pilots, because of this ability to get close, fired from much nearer, and that explains why they had this higher destruction rate of German planes. Now, Hitler had planned an invasion of Britain by Germany in mid-September 1940. He had to postpone that invasion, and it never happened, as we know, because of what happened in the Battle of Britain, with 303 Squadron playing really a crucial role in that. So I don't want to upset anyone. I'm partly British myself, but in a sense, it's ironic that the Poles, when attacked by Germany, were left on their own, despite treaty obligations, whereas when Britain was about to be attacked, the Poles are playing a crucial role in actually defending Britain through the courage of their pilots. Now, back to my father. So he is retreating eastwards through Poland, when suddenly, I think it was on September the 17th, the Russians invaded Poland from the east. So the Poles are suddenly fighting the Germans and the Russians all at the same time. It's a nightmare situation. So he is trying to get to the Hungarian or Romanian border, but he's captured. He's captured on the 22nd of October and becomes a prisoner of war. He's released after a few months because there's in effect no more war between Russia and Poland. but he joins the Polish underground army and does various things in that army, but eventually is captured, arrested in May 1940 and sent to a labor camp in Buzuluk. Now, I've looked up Buzuluk on the maps, and it's near the Kazakhstan border. It was, by all accounts, a terrible place to be in. But then he's suddenly released in June 1941. And I'll pause there with my father and return to June 41 a bit later. But that's what happened to him. Now let's turn to my mother. She was born Irena Yushkovska. She was born in 1916 near Vilnius. Now, Vilnius is now the capital of Lithuania, but there was no Lithuania in 1916. It was part of the Russian Empire. She regarded herself as Polish and not Russian. She, soon after leaving school, this seems incredible to me because she never talked about it to me, she married one of the teachers at the school. So this is an 18-year-old leaving school and almost immediately marrying one of the teachers at the school, who was called Arnold Jaskowski. He also happened to be an army reservist. Okay, the following year, 1936, she begins studies at the University of Vilnius, or in Poland then it's called Vilna, but that only lasted a year. I'm not quite sure why it was only a year. So we moved to 1939, and Arnold Jaskowski, who's a reservist, is now called into the Polish army and ends up being sent to Narvik, the Narvik campaign in April 1940. And we leave him there because I don't know what really happened to him there. No record exists of what my mother's first husband did at Narvik, except that he was awarded the French Croix de Guerre, which is, just about their highest military honor. But apart from that, I really don't know anything about Arnold Jaskowski. So let's now focus on my mother. So she is part of the Polish Women's Corps in the Polish army. She too is facing Russian attack from the east, from September 1917, or mid-September. And she too is making her way to the Romanian border. Now, at this point, I want to go off on a tangent. I want to leave my parents where they are at the moment and talk about somebody else who is also making their way to the Romanian border. It's an astonishing story. And I'm going to begin this going off at a tangent by asking you, does anyone know when women's athletics were first introduced into the Olympic Games? It's a question for you. Does anyone know when were women's athletics first introduced into the Olympic Games? Any answers?
Berlin.
Berlin, 1936. No. Bit earlier.
No idea. Oh, there's not. There's pictures of ladies with long skirts playing tennis, isn't there? But I've no.
No, this wasn't ladies in long skirts. Now I'll tell you, it was the Amsterdam Olympics of 1928. Now, why am I mentioning this? It's an incredible story. Right, apparently the first event, women's event, that was completed in the Amsterdam Olympics was the women's discus. And it was won by a great Polish sportswoman called Halina Konopacka. She then held the world record for the discus. She was a fabulous sportswoman. She was Poland's second or third best tennis player, a superb skier, and a brilliant athlete. So she wins the first ever gold medal awarded to a woman in the Olympic Games. That's an amazing stat to know about. How does it connect with my mother? We'll see in a moment. Now, you can Google Halina Konopacka, And you'll see that she is not a sort of big, burly, muscular woman that you might expect winning the women's discus. She's quite the opposite. She's very tall, very slim, very long arms. And what she was able to do was perfect a technique of very quick around the circle and very quick release with her long arms. And that's what made her the best at the women's discus at that time. Right. After the Olympic Games, she still continued athletics, but eventually retired and married someone who was a high-up official in the Polish treasury. When the war broke out in 1939, her husband, was ordered to get all the Polish gold and bullion out of Warsaw and transport it towards Romania in lorries and vans. And so his wife, Halina Konopatska, the gold medal winner, was one of the women driving the lorry full of gold down to the Romanian border. And that's why she acquired the nickname Double Gold, for her Olympic exploits and getting Polish gold out through Romania, which she succeeded in doing. She drove it to France, actually, and eventually emigrated with her husband, I think, to the USA, where she became a leading fashion designer and painter. An absolutely remarkable woman and career. Do Google her, Halina Konopatska. Right. So my mother is part of this movement towards the Romanian border that Halina Konopatska has just succeeded in crossing. But my mother doesn't succeed in crossing. She's captured and sent into a labor camp in Russia. I do not know where, but I remember her telling me the conditions were absolutely terrible. She became very ill, and she said was actually possibly on the point of death. When suddenly, in June 1941, Hitler invades Russia. What is the result of that for the Poles? A third of a million Poles captured in Russia now have suddenly become, overnight, the allies of the Russians, because there's the common enemy, Germany. So the Poles, naturally, need to be released by the Russians, a bit reluctant to start with, but eventually are encouraged by Churchill and Roosevelt to do the decent thing, release all the Poles. Start to think, okay, here's a good idea. We're going to make all these Poles fight for us against the Germans. We're going to use them as cannon fodder. No way, says Churchill and Roosevelt. They are to be transported down to the Middle East to join up with the British 8th Army. And so that's what happened. All these Poles were suddenly being fed properly again, given proper medicines, and that's why my mother survived. By the way, had Hitler not invaded Germany, I probably wouldn't be speaking to you today. She probably wouldn't have survived. So in a weird sort of way, well, this is a bit weird as far as I'm concerned, I owe my life to Hitler's invasion of Russia. Thank you, Adolf. But, you know, how strange is that? Now, being transported down from inner Russia down to the Middle East takes a long time, even by a modern train. But all these Poles were transported down by slow cattle trucks. My mother says the journey took about 2 weeks. And I have a piece of paper here, which I'm going to hold. You won't be able to read it, but here it is. I'm holding it up. Can you see that? Hello? Can you see that?
If you go up a bit, so it's right across your face. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it.
Now, you won't be able to read that, but that is a piece of paper which says, when my father, on this train, crossed from the Soviet Union into Persia. And it's the 2nd of April, 1942. How is it I got this piece of paper? Well, it's a photocopy of documents held at RAF Northolt, because that's where all the records, army records of Polish army people who survived the war, or even who didn't survive, that's where they held in RAF Northolt. And thanks partly to the efforts of my wife, Margaret, we managed to eventually get to RAF Northolt, and that's where I was able to find all these documents. Now, somewhere on this journey, my father gets out of the train, on whatever platform it is, starts talking to a young woman, and guess what? She will be my mother. That's how they met. It's a rather romantic story on some platform in some godforsaken spot somewhere in Russia, or was it Persia? I don't know. Eventually, they were transported to Palestine, as it was then. Tel Aviv was then Palestine, and that's where they lived for a while. My father was by now mainly in charge of training cadets. My mother rejoined the Polish Army Corps, and I'm going to show you a photograph of her in army uniform.
Again, hold it up a bit further. Wow.
Okay?
Yeah.
Right. So that's my mum in about 1942-3. Right.
Very glamorous.
Sorry?
She has a very glamorous face, very, very beautiful.
Well, she used to tell me she modelled herself on Greta Garbo. I mean, okay, fine. That is what she told me. Right. I'm not sure whether my parents, well, they weren't my parents, I wasn't around, but whether my Franciszek and Joanna, did they start living together? I don't know. But eventually I was born in November 1943. My mother was released from army duties. Now, let's just think about this. So here I am, I'm born to a married woman who has had a child by a Polish army officer, major high-ranking Polish officer, out of wedlock, shall we use that old-fashioned phrase. So this must have been regarded as rather scandalous. And that explains why in early reports, well, in the end-of-year reports about my father, written by his superior officer, for 1943, 4 and 5, I am not mentioned as, well, just not mentioned. The people who are mentioned are his two sons by his first marriage. But I, who now his son by his second marriage, am not mentioned. It's too scandalous to acknowledge my existence. In 1945, my father contracted pneumonia and tuberculosis and spent quite a large part of that year in hospital. In 1946, my parents decided to try and get married. Now, how can my mother get married when she's already married? Well, they were able to seek an annulment of the marriage, not from the Catholic Church, which refused, but from the Greek Orthodox Church, which agreed to recognize my mother's marriage to Arnold Borkowski as dissolved because no one had heard of him for 7 years. He was missing, presumed dead, no one had heard of him. So that's why my mother and father got that decree enabling them to get married. And I have a piece of paper here, which I'll hold up in a moment, which is a letter, well, a document from the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Alexandria, recording that my parents are now free to marry. Okay. It's amazing to have this piece of paper. So again, thank you to RAF Northolt for having all these documents. So soon after that, they got married. Now, I don't have a wedding photograph for them, but I do have a rather underexposed photograph of them round about that time when they got married. So I'll hold it up. That about the right height?
Yeah.
Higher? Lower?
Oh, wow.
Okay.
That's fine.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are my parents around about the time of their wedding. And after they got married, I was then recognized in end of year reports on my father. For a while, they lived in Cairo and Alexandria. My mother, would you believe, started singing in nightclubs. She had a pretty good voice. And yeah, my father, I don't think was too happy with that, but that's what she told me she did. Sang a few times in Polish nightclubs in Alexandria. And my father became the town commandant, the Polish town commandant of Alexandria, and managed the Polish army football team in Alexandria. And then in 1947, they decided, as I said before, not to return to a communist Poland, but to come to England. And they landed on the 8th of October, 1947 in Liverpool. We then moved around various cities and places. And eventually, as I said, right at the beginning, they settled in Wembley. My father died in 1959 and my mother in 1975. So that really completes the story of my parents. But I just want to end with another incredible journey, which has nothing really to do with my parents, but is connected in time and location. And that is the incredible story of Wojtek the soldier bear. Now, you may be astonished by this if you haven't heard this before, but this is a true story, and there are books written about this. Wojtek was a bear cub who was bought by a Polish soldier somewhere in Syria soon after the little bear's mother had been shot. So here's this little bear cub bought by a Polish soldier who starts looking after it, feeding it, and of course his friends are all doing the same. They're all looking after this bear cub. The bear cub gradually gets bigger and bigger. And there are photographs of, as the bear is growing up, starts wrestling with his friends, the people, the Poles looking after him. Wherever they go, they take him with them. Eventually, authorities are starting to get concerned about how can you carry on in the war transporting a bear around. So the only way they could get around that was to issue Wojtek, the bear, with an army card, officially enlisting him in the Polish army as a private. He's Private Wojtek of the Polish army. And wonderful photographs of vans and lorries being driven around with Wojtek hanging off at the back. Now, let's pause here for a moment and think about what does Wojtek see? Wojtek sees all these lovely people feeding him, human beings. Wojtek doesn't know he's a bear. He just doesn't know. He's been brought up by all these men, we call them, the soldiers. He thinks he's rather like one of them. He doesn't know he's a bear, which is an amazing thing to think about. Now, eventually, Wojtek's unit was transferred to Italy and took part in the Battle of Monte Cassino, a crucial battle in May 1944. And Wojtek was seen, photographed, I don't think it was photographed, but he was seen carrying ammunition boxes to the front line throughout the few days of that horrendous battle. He'd been sort of trained to do that, and there he was actually doing it in one of the most crucial battles in World War II. What happened to him at the end of the war? He was eventually transferred to Edinburgh Zoo. You can imagine the emotional scenes, and I'm beginning to feel choked up myself. The emotional scenes of Wojtek parting from those soldiers that looked after him for 3 or 4 years, possibly a bit less, his friends, and suddenly they're leaving him, and he's being put in a cage in Edinburgh Zoo. Well, that was, of course, a very sad moment. But eventually, Wojtek gets used to being in the zoo. He becomes the star turn of Edinburgh Zoo for the remainder of his life. I can't quite remember when Wojtek died, but he was the animal that people went to see for some years as the star turn, shall we say, in Edinburgh Zoo. Wojtek had a problem to start with because he couldn't understand Scottish people. He was used to Polish. People had been talking to him in Polish. Suddenly he was hearing these weird sort of Scottish sounds. And that was a problem to start with, but eventually he got used to that. And just to end off the story, Wojtek's memorial is now to be found in Princess Street Gardens in Edinburgh. So next time you're in Edinburgh, do visit Princess Street Gardens. You know where they are. And look out for the memorial of Wojtek. Thank you very much.
There we go.
Any questions?
Thank you, Andrew. That was informative as well as interesting and amusing.
Thank you.
So I am sure my friends here today would wish to actually make comments or ask you questions on that. Chris.
Oh, millions of questions, Andrew. I've known you for so long and I didn't know any of that story. I grew up in West London amongst the Polish emigre community very much.
What? Hammersmith?
Hammersmith, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, going to school with Polish speaker. I used to go to live to school with Polish speaker, so it was a Polish all the way in the car. And so on and so on and so on. But I'd never heard this story of so I've been assuming this was the story of your family coming to London, the route most of them came. This story, how many people got caught up in this movement to Palestine? It's not a bit of the history. My own father was in Egypt and then up through Italy with that campaign. How many people came down that route from Russia through into Palestine, Egypt, and then back up through Italy?
Yeah, I checked those figures, and it's about 1/3 of a million.
Good grief.
Yeah, about 1/3 of a million. And most of them ended up in England after the war. And that's why you had a big Polish population in England, particularly parts of London, Ealing, Hammersmith, Kensington. Yeah. And then there was the second Polish wave of immigrants when Poland joined the EU. Was that 89, 1989, something like that? And so a few years ago, Polish, it was estimated Polish was the second most spoken language in England because of all these Polish immigrants through 2 different waves. Yeah.
Can I ask a second question? How did your father manage to get the Greek Orthodox Church to regard him as being connected enough to be able to do that?
I wish, Chris, I'd asked him. I wish he was here. How did you manage that? Because, of course, they were Roman Catholics. They had nothing to do with the Greek Orthodox Church. They were desperate to get married, perhaps to make my position legitimate. But I cannot answer your question. How is it that they persuaded the Greek Orthodox Church to allow this? I don't know. But, yeah, it's a great question to which I cannot answer. Yeah. Anything else?
Hattie.
It's an interesting fact about the tallness of the Olympic tennis player, Polish woman, and it is now. Sorry?
Discus throw.
I'm sorry, I can't make out that word.
Discus thrower. She
Discus
threw
thrower.
the discus. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't manage to hear that properly either.
Oh, sorry.
She currently, the tallest women in the world are from Latvia.
Okay. Right.
Interesting. So if she was from Lithuania, as is, I mean, right?
Yeah.
Vilnius.
Yes, I think she was born in Lithuania. Yeah, but she counts as Polish. Yeah.
Anyway, maybe similar stock.
She used to wear a beret when she was competing. So if you Google her, you'll see her in the discus circle, limbering up, wearing a beret. Always wore a beret when she competed in sport. Yeah, that's her thing. Some of you, I feel, might want to Google her. I do suggest you do. So I'm going to spell out slowly her surname. Her
That could go in chat.
Her first name is easy. Halina, Halina. Halina. Now, Konopatska is Kono. That's the easy bit. Kono. Patska is Packa. Packa. So it's all one word. Kono. Packa. Halina Konopatska.
Wow.
Right.
Certainly a name to conjure with. You mentioned, amusingly enough, you mentioned Paul Boateng earlier. And you probably know this, but I will say it anyway. Him and his mother are Quakers who I meet at friends' house.
Really? Yeah. Oh, okay. I remember Paul Boateng very well. Apart from being a brilliant student, he had very big, bushy hair. And he only just fitted in through my tutorial room. So big was his very bushy afro hair, which I think he later curbed somewhat. But that's an image I have of him trying to get into my tutorial room.
Can I ask a question, Andrew, about the way you were talking about your parents when they were both young? And I'm not sure I understand whether they were, at the minute, the Baltic states have Russians living there. At the end of Russian influence, some Russians were left there, and there's a really clear distinction between being a Lithuanian or a Latvian and being a Russian who happens to have fetched up there when the music stopped.
Yeah.
And I wasn't clear whether your parents and your mother's first husband, their identity came from, were they Poles who happened to be in Lithuania, or was there at that time were a lot of Lithuanians and Latvians identifying as Polish because it had been part of the same Austro-Hungarian?
Yes.
I'm just trying to get my head around some ethnic identity stuff there.
You might well spend a lot of time trying to do that, Chris, because it's a very awkward question. The leading historian on Poland, modern historian, a guy called Norman Davis, and he begins his history of Poland by having a chapter called "Who Are the Poles?", in which he goes into this very question Chris has just mentioned. Who are the Poles? Especially in the east of Poland, it's a very complicated picture. So my parents are a very good example of this complicated picture. Technically, well, they were actually born in the Russian Empire. So my mother knew Vilnius. There was no Lithuania then. My father knew Lvov, now Ukraine, but then part of the Russian Empire. Are they Russians? I'm not quite sure what the law is on this, actually. That they probably are, but they regard themselves as Poles, they were ethnic Poles, and never as Russians. And then when Poland gained its independence in 1918, it was very easy for all those Poles like my parents to regard themselves as Poles. Yeah. But Chris, that's a tricky question which you might like to discuss with Norman Davis, the leading historian of Poland. Yeah, it's a tricky one. Yeah. It's been estimated that of Poland's 35 million population, say, at the beginning of World War II, at least half were not completely pure Poles, but a sort of mixture of all sorts of other peoples. Yeah.
There is some historians who state that Poland was left on its own after the end of World War II by Churchill's agreement with Stalin.
Yes.
Which was, as far as I gather, pretty nasty stuff.
You're referring to two conferences, the Tehran Conference, I think, of 1943, and the Yalta Conference of 1945, in which Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin agreed that at the end of the war, Russia should have part of what had been Eastern Poland, and Poland should gain part of what had been Eastern Germany. There was a sort of mass movement of Poland about 100 miles eastwards. Stalin promised Churchill and Roosevelt that there would be free elections in Poland, but that never happened. Churchill was forced to agree because by then Roosevelt was a very ill man and died soon after Yalta. And Stalin, I think, played on that Roosevelt wasn't up to defending the Polish cause. And Churchill found himself isolated and having to agree to Stalin's promise that there'd be free elections in Poland. Yeah, which never happened.
But that's I remember reading that history of great sadness, really, that nasty things happened there. But
question.
Do, Chris.
I think it's really difficult for most of us on this call, Andrew, whose ancestry is more settled, to begin to understand what refugee status is remotely like. I know I have German friends whose ancestors were placed by the Germans in Moldova as part of the Austro-Hungarian Germanic occupation of Moldova, were then kicked out in the First World War, were resettled by the Germans in Poland, were then Germans who came westwards as the Russians took Poland. And so they were fled and resettled again and had that multiple set of upheavals. The description of your parents' upheavals, I think the question for me is, what impact does that have? What do you think it had on them? And indeed on you? I'm mindful of the fact my mother would never apply for an English passport, a full English passport, because she was terrified. Although she identified as British, she was terrified the British would not give her a passport because her father was French and therefore she acquired French nationality at birth in the law as it was at that time. And she was always afraid to apply for a British passport in case she was told she didn't belong. And I wonder what impact that whole story has had on you, and indeed what you think it had on your parents in terms of that ability to settle and believe you belonged.
Again, a great question, Chris. They felt very patriotic about Poland, increasingly so because of what had happened. And so I was brought up in the emigre community in London, the Polish emigre community. So we went to Polish concerts and Polish cafes in South Kensington and so on. They themselves had a difficulty at the end of the war because, as you already know, their beginnings are complicated. Are they Russian? Are they Ukrainian? Are they Austrian? What are they? But then comes another problem at the end of the war. Right, by now they're Poles. They believe their polls. But the Polish government, after everybody got out of Poland who could, a Polish government was established in exile in Kensington. The Rubens Hotel was where Poland existed for the Polish exiled government throughout the war. But towards the end of the war, Stalin insisted that the British should no longer regard Rubens Hotel as being Poland, and that they should transfer their allegiance, the British should transfer their allegiance to the newly elected government that was going to come into Poland at the end of the war, which turns out to be communist. Right. So the British went along with that. I think this is a black mark in Britain's history. They went along with that request from Stalin, and they ceased to recognize the Polish exiled government in London as the true representatives of Poland, even though they were the people who had fought all along with escape and heroic things. Yeah, so that's one reason why the Poles felt grateful to Britain for being allowed in, but also hurting a bit about what had happened. Now, the result of that was that my parents refused to recognize Britain's recognition of the newly elected Polish communist government. And so they regarded themselves as stateless. So
Wow.
that they regard themselves, whether they in law they were stateless, I don't know, but they regard themselves as stateless. Therefore, I was stateless until my mother sought naturalization in, I think, 1965. And the reason she did that was, well, I was originally going to be a solicitor. That was my idea when I did my law degree. And I discovered that you couldn't be a solicitor then unless you were British. You could only be enrolled as a solicitor if you were British. So we sought naturalization, and so I became naturalized British in, I think, about 1964. Now,
Wow.
yeah, so we were stateless for a while. A strange status.
So you couldn't have travelled?
We didn't have no, we didn't travel, didn't have a passport. I didn't have a birth certificate. How could I get a passport without a birth certificate? Actually, I now know what I could have done. I could have gone to RAF Norfolk, where all these documents are kept, proving I was born on the 7th of November, 1943. So you've just missed my birthday by a day. That was yesterday. Okay.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And Andrew, where were you born?
I was born in what is now Tel Aviv. It was then Tel Aviv. It was then Palestine. We now know it as the capital of Israel. Yeah. So that's another thing. Was I Palestinian? Palestinian by birth, Polish by parentage. And it's the parentage that counts.
I have a number of friends who were Hungarian, whose parents came out of Hungary in 1952 in the uprising then.
1958, I think, 58.
No, 58. So yeah. Sorry. Yes. And
56.
56. Let's settle on 56.
Well, it was 50 something. And but one of them actually started to find out about all the people who were left, and now he goes. He went before he died. He went with his family to show them where all their relations come from, and he still found he had uncles and aunts and all that lot who still live in Hungary, and that's the remarkable thing, which he has a picture of a newspaper where he is walking down one of the London roads with a lot of other Hungarians, and they have flags, and it was kind of support the Hungarian people who had just come to London at the time. He's about, 3 or 4, but it's a remarkable picture, him with a cap and a big coat on, a big sign saying "Support the Hungarians." You know,
Yes. Now,
quite.
on the question of the Hungarian connection, I can tell you that my primary school in Wembley, St. Joseph's Catholic Primary School, was opposite the main entrance to Wembley Stadium. So we used to see crowds streaming in on Wednesday afternoons for internationals held at Wembley. And I well remember a particular foggy Wednesday afternoon in November 1953 when a famous match took place. So the question is, which match?
That's Pushkas, isn't it?
Well, he's part of the story.
Yeah. It's a famous Hungarian beating of
Scored
England.
a couple of goals. It was
Yeah.
labelled the match of the century, England versus Hungary. England had never lost to foreign opposition at home, and Hungary had at that time an absolutely brilliant team, the best team never to have won the World Cup, in my view, and Hungary won 6-3. Yes. And English football didn't recover for quite a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's my Hungarian connection.
I think most of us, because we're not desperate, well, I am into football, but most people, most of the Quakers on the school wouldn't be desperately into football. We don't always recognise how important events like that are to people's identity. I was in Bosnia, as you know, Andrew, just after the ceasefire in the Yugoslav Civil War. And in the very badly damaged stadium in Sarajevo, Italy decided to come and play Bosnia. And the emotion of the local men, the mere fact the match was happening, but then the fact that Bosnia beat Italy was just so staggeringly important to identity and that self-worth of your whole people.
Yeah. Yeah. Goodbye, Judith.
Oh.
Andrew, thank you so much.
It's been a great pleasure. I thought I was going to get quite emotional doing this, but I held on.
So emotion's a very big thing, and I think it's all part of us, part of what we are. So,
apart from that, Rotek. No,
Wojtek. 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 J in Polish is like a y. So it's Wojtek.
Okay.
What about him, Chris?
Well, that's the one point where you got emotional. You really, that idea of him being sort of abandoned in the zoo.
Abandoned in Edinburgh Zoo, talking to all these jocks and their strange accents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Andrew.
Hello.
Hattie here. Is there a book, a storybook about Wojciech's journey?
There is. I should have it by me. It's not there at the moment.
It could go in the email.
Just
Patsy.
Yeah. Just Google Wojtek the Bear. Wojtek the Soldier Bear. I think that's the name of the book. Just Google that. Up it'll come. Yeah. It featured. He featured on BBC News quite recent. I saw a BBC online item about Wojtek because it's some anniversary of his about Edinburgh, whatever it was. Yeah. And remember when you're in Princess Street Gardens, look out for the monument.
Lovely.
Well, friends, we have come to that time when we have to perhaps wander off and do other things during the day.
Okay.
I'd like to thank Andrew very much for his talk today, and would would encourage other people to watch this on, as that phrase goes, on catch up. But before you go, next week's talk, it is the Grenfell Tower Inquiry, and it's by our friend Geoffrey Smith. So do come and listen. Unfortunately, I will not be able to join you, as my little brother is coming down for a few days with his wife. So I have to be the genial host and look after him. So I will see you all soon, friends. Have a good day.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you
Pleasure.
very much indeed. Thank you.
Bye. Bye all. Yep.